You don't belong here. This place is for nice people, not people like you.
Racist flight attendant kicks out blind girl, and sister's bold move shocks the airline proves that sometimes the flight attendants who assault disabled children because they believe blind black passengers don't belong in main cabin are about to discover that kicking white cane from under 12-year-old will trigger response so powerful it transforms entire aircraft into site of civil rights action. That their ableism and racism will be met not with silence but with song, with anthem that their grandparents' generation tried to silence, with We Shall Overcome sung by two young black girls who refuse to accept that hatred has won, because what flight attendant Marlene Davidson didn't know when she decided Faith Williams was too blind and too black to deserve dignity was that physically assaulting disabled child would awaken collective conscience of passengers who'd been silent witnesses, would spark intervention that connected present discrimination to civil rights struggles of past, would expose not just her own hatred but complicity of everyone who watched and did nothing, and the confidence with which Marlene kicked that white cane, the certainty with which she told Faith that disabled passengers need to board separately and should have stayed home, showed how comfortable some people had become expressing hatred against disabled people, showed how normalized it was to assault blind child and expect no consequences, showed how ableism and racism operated together too. Mark certain bodies as unwelcome, as disruptive, as less deserving of basic human dignity. Your kind always wants special treatment, blind and black and whatever excuse you use, you don't belong in the main cabin with regular passengers, disabled passengers need to board separately, you're disrupting everyone, perhaps you should have stayed home instead of making problems, your grandmother should have taught you to stay where you belong. Marlene Davidson said to Faith Williams and her sister Hope on Delta Airlines Flight 1165 from Atlanta to Nashville, said after deliberately kicking 12-year-old blind girl's white cane from under her, said while Faith lay on aircraft floor crying and searching blindly for mobility aid that was her lifeline, said with voice that carried through cabin so other passengers could hear, said with body language that communicated she expected agreement or at least acceptance of her cruelty, said with confidence born from lifetime of expressing prejudice without facing consequences, and her words hit Faith like physical blows, hit her with message that her disability made her unwelcome, hit her with characterization of blindness as excuse rather than reality, hit her with racism that saw black disabled child as particular kind of problem requiring removal. The statement "you're kind and regular passengers and stay where you belong" landed in that aircraft cabin with weight of every discriminatory assumption about disabled people being burdens, landed with implication that Faith's blindness disqualified her from occupying same spaces as non-disabled travelers, landed with racism that saw black girl as inherently out of place in main cabin, landed with ableism that characterized white cane as disruption rather than accommodation, and Faith lying on floor with hands trembling as she searched for cane she couldn't see heard those words and understood she was being told she didn't deserve to be on this plane, didn't deserve to visit her grandmother's grave, didn't deserve to exist in public spaces, and the cruelty of hearing that while unable to find mobility device that adult had deliberately kicked away from her, while physically vulnerable on aircraft floor, while surrounded by passengers who watched but didn't help, made trauma compound. Made discrimination feel not just verbal but physical, made her understand viscerally that her body was being marked as wrong, as unwelcome, as deserving of violence. This wasn't something Faith's parents had warned might happen in distant past. This wasn't discrimination her grandmother had faced during segregation that existed only in history. This was happening right now in 2025 on commercial airline where disability accommodations supposedly existed, where Americans with Disabilities Act supposedly protected blind travelers, where assaulting passengers was supposedly criminal offense, but here was Marlene Davidson kicking white cane from under blind child, watching her fall, standing over her with arms crossed, telling her she didn't belong, and if you think discrimination against disabled people is something we solved, if you believe blind black children can travel safely without facing violence, if you imagine that 2025 means ableism and racism have disappeared, then you need to understand that physically assaulting disabled children still happens, still operates through flight attendants who believe certain bodies don't belong in certain spaces, maybe worse now because it happens while everyone pretends we're inclusive, while people claim to value disability rights, while passengers record on phones but don't intervene, while witnesses choose documentation over protection. Faith and Hope had experienced microaggressions before, had dealt with people who talked past faith to Hope as if blindness meant deafness or cognitive impairment, strangers who grabbed Faith's arm without asking instead of offering elbow, adults who spoke loudly and slowly as if blindness affected comprehension, but having flight attendant deliberately kick white cane from under her, having adult physically assault her and then blame her for disruption, having someone suggest she should have stayed home rather than travel to visit grandmother's grave, felt different, felt like violence that was deliberate and hateful, felt like discrimination that went beyond ignorance into territory of assault. And Faith had been shocked when she fell, shocked by sudden loss of balance, shocked by pain of hitting aircraft floor, shocked by realization that adult had done this deliberately, but she wasn't entirely surprised because their grandmother had taught them that hatred existed, that disabled people faced violence, that being black and disabled meant facing compounded prejudice, but knowing discrimination existed didn't make experiencing assault less terrifying, didn't make searching blindly for cane less humiliating, didn't prepare 12-year-old for being told by uniformed authority figure that she should have stayed home. Hope, where is it? Faith said with voice that shook with fear and confusion, with hands that searched the floor desperately. I can't find it. Why did I fall? Did I trip? What happened? And her questions were heartbreaking in their innocence, were blind child trying to understand why she'd suddenly lost balance, were attempt to find rational explanation for what had been deliberate assault, and Hope, who'd been guiding her sister gently by elbow, who'd been helping Faith navigate aircraft aisle, who'd seen Marlene deliberately kick the cane, dropped to her knees beside Faith with fury and protective love mixing, dropped saying, Faith, are you okay? Did you get hurt? I'm getting your cane. That woman kicked it. She kicked your cane on purpose, and having to tell her blind baby sister that adult had assaulted her, having to explain that Faith's fall hadn't been accident but violence, having to watch Faith process that information, made Hope understand they were facing hatred that was active and intentional. If you believe disabled children deserve protection from violence regardless of their race or disability, keep watching, because what happens when Hope remembers their grandmother's lessons about civil rights will show you that sometimes the most powerful resistance is song. And if you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere because of how your body works, drop a comment below and tell us your story. Tell us where you're watching from and what time it is, because you need to see what happens when two young black girls transform aircraft full of silent witnesses into space of collective resistance. This story doesn't end the way you expect. So hit that like button if you stand against ableism and racism, and subscribe to this channel because we're exposing discrimination that still destroys lives. Passengers throughout cabin gasped hearing Faith cry out, gasped seeing 12-year-old fall, gasped watching her hands search desperately for white cane that had clattered down aisle, and someone pulled out phone to record, someone else whispered, oh my God, someone muttered, that's terrible, but not one passenger moved to help, not one adult challenged Marlene's action, not one witness intervened to retrieve cane or assist fallen child. And their collective gasp without action, their shock without intervention, their willingness to document but not protect, gave Marlene permission to continue, gave her confidence that her assault would face no immediate consequences, gave her sense that passengers agreed Faith was problem rather than victim, and Faith, hearing gasps but receiving no help, hearing reactions but feeling no hands reaching to assist, hearing witness without rescue, understood she was alone except for Hope, understood that cabin full of adults had chosen to watch rather than help, but to understand how joyful blind girl traveling to honor her grandmother's memory ended up on aircraft floor being told she should have stayed home, how trip that was supposed to be sacred family tradition became site of violent discrimination, how Marlene's ableism collided with sisters whose grandmother had taught them that silence in face of injustice was itself injustice. We need to go back 6 hours to morning in their Atlanta home, where this day started not with violence but with love and remembrance and preparation for pilgrimage that meant everything to them. Faith Grace Williams was 12 years old and had been blind since birth, was 7th grader at Georgia Academy for the Blind, where she excelled in music and literature, was girl whose lack of sight had never diminished her joy or her determination, was child who navigated world with white cane and spatial awareness and confidence her parents had nurtured since infancy, and she loved singing. Loved feeling vibrations of music through her body, loved memorizing lyrics and melodies, loved how Songs created pictures in her mind that she couldn't see with eyes, and her older sister Hope Marie Williams was 14 and had been Faith's protector and guide since they were small, was girl who'd learned early that world wasn't always kind to her blind sister, was teenager who'd developed fierce protective instinct mixed with deep respect for Faith's independence, and their bond was profound, was connection built on trust and love and shared experiences, was relationship where Hope provided eyes when needed but never made Faith feel less capable. The sisters had lost their grandmother Ruth Williams 6 months earlier, had lost woman who'd raised their father, who'd been central figure in their family, who'd been civil rights activist in 1960s, who'd marched in Selma, who'd been arrested for sitting at whites-only lunch counter, who'd taught them everything about dignity and resistance and standing up for what was right, and Ruth had been particularly close to Faith, had spent hours teaching her granddaughter songs from civil rights movement, had explained history through music, had made Faith memorize We Shall Overcome and Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around, had told stories about marching while singing, about how music gave courage when fear threatened, about how collective voice was more powerful than individual silence. And losing her had devastated both girls, but especially Faith, who'd felt grandmother understood her in ways others didn't, who'd learned from Ruth that disability didn't diminish worth, that blindness was just different way of experiencing world. Their family made pilgrimage to Ruth's grave in Nashville every year on anniversary of her death, made journey that was sacred tradition, made trip that honored woman who'd shaped them all, and this year was first time Faith and Hope were traveling alone without parents, was milestone that represented growing independence, was trust their parents were extending because girls had proven themselves responsible, and Faith had been so excited about this trip, had been looking forward to sitting at grandmother's grave and singing the songs Ruth had taught her, had prepared carefully choosing which dress to wear and which hair ribbons, had packed her Braille music book with civil rights songs, had wanted everything to be perfect because this was honoring grandmother who'd meant everything to her. That morning Faith and Hope had woken early with mixture of excitement and solemnity, had gotten dressed in their best clothes because grandmother would have wanted them looking nice, had helped each other with hair and shoes, had packed carry-on bags with snacks and entertainment for flight, and their mother had driven them to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport while talking about Ruth, while sharing memories, while reminding them that grandmother would be proud of how grown up they were becoming, and check-in had gone smoothly with agent who'd been kind and patient, who'd asked if Faith needed any special assistance, who'd processed their tickets efficiently, and TSA security had been routine with officers who understood how to screen passengers with disabilities, who'd been respectful and professional, and they'd proceeded to gate with plenty of time. Boarding had been careful process with Hope guiding Faith down jetway, with Hope describing each step, with Faith using her white cane to navigate, with both girls working together in rhythm they'd developed over years, and they'd found their seats in row 8, had settled with Faith in window seats so she could feel vibrations of flight, with Hope in middle seat beside her, and initial crew interactions had been pleasant with male flight attendant named James who'd helped them stow bags, who'd asked Faith if she needed anything, who'd been respectful and kind, and another attendant named Patricia who'd brought them apple juice before takeoff. And nothing in these early interactions suggested problems ahead. Nothing indicated that Marlene Davidson working aft cabin would see Faith's white cane and make assessment that was hateful, that would target blind black child for removal, that would culminate in physical assault. But Marlene appeared as they were settling in and her face changed when she saw Faith, changed as she registered the white cane and the dark skin, changed as she made judgment that was immediate and negative, and she watched them with expression that Faith couldn't see but that Hope noticed, watched with body language that communicated disapproval, watched with focus that felt hostile rather than professional, and when Faith accidentally bumped Marlene's leg with her cane while adjusting position in her seat, when blind child made contact she couldn't see coming, Marlene's response was disproportionate, was sharp tones saying watch where you're putting that thing, was first microaggression that made Hope's protective instincts activate, was first sign that this crew member saw Faith as problem rather than passenger deserving care, and moments later as Faith stood to adjust something in overhead bin, as she reached upward with Hope guiding her movements, as she used her white cane for balance while standing in narrow aisle, Marlene watched with expression that twisted into disgust, watched with lip that curled, watched with hatred that was visible to everyone except blind girl who couldn't see it coming. As Faith reached for her seat to sit back down, As she oriented herself using white cane to find position, as she moved with careful deliberation that blind travelers develop, Marlene stepped forward with movement that was sudden and aggressive, stepped forward and kicked the white cane from under Faith with force that was deliberate, kicked with motion that swept mobility device away, kicked with violence that was unmistakable, and Faith, who'd been depending on that cane for balance, who'd been using it to navigate space she couldn't see, who'd been trusting that device to keep her safe, suddenly had nothing supporting her, suddenly felt ground disappear, suddenly experienced terror of falling without warning, and she crashed to the aircraft floor with impact that was hard, crashed crying out in shock and pain, crashed with sound that made every passenger turn to look, crashed in moment that transformed routine boarding into sight of assault. Hope heard her sister's cry and saw her fall and dropped to her knees immediately, dropped beside Faith with protective instinct that was automatic, dropped cradling her sister who was confused and hurt and scared, and she said, "Faith, are you okay? Did you get hurt? What happened?" And her voice carried panic that came from seeing sister assaulted, carried fury at Marlene who'd done this deliberately, carried desperation to comfort Faith who was trembling, and Faith lying on aircraft floor with hands that shook, reached out searching, reached out with movements that were frantic, reached out trying to find white cane that was her lifeline, that was her independence, that was device she needed to navigate world, and not finding it in immediate reach made panic intensify, made her cry out, "Hope, where is it? I can't find it. Why did I fall? What happened to me?" Faith's hands trembled as she searched the floor blindly, trembled with fear and confusion, trembled with vulnerability that came from losing mobility aid without warning, and her questions were heartbreaking in their bewilderment, were blind child trying to understand why she'd suddenly fallen, were attempt to make sense of assault through cognitive framework that expected adults to be safe, and she said, "Hope, where is my cane? I need it. I can't find it. Did I drop it? Why did I fall? There's something on the floor," and having to search for device she couldn't see while lying on aircraft floor surrounded by strangers, having to experience helplessness of being blind without mobility aid in unfamiliar space, having to feel exposed and vulnerable in moment of crisis, made trauma compound, made assault feel not just physical but existential, made her understand viscerally that her independence had been stolen. Passengers throughout cabin gasped hearing Faith cry out, gasped seeing 12-year-old crash to floor, gasped with shock at sudden violence, and someone immediately pulled out phone to record, pulled it out with instinct to document rather than help, pulled it out choosing witness over intervention, and others watched silently with expressions that ranged from concern to discomfort to something that looked like satisfaction, watched without moving to help, watched without challenging Marlene's action, watched without retrieving cane that had clattered down aisle, and their collective response of gasp without action, of shock without intervention, of witness without protection, showed how easily people chose documentation over defense, showed how comfortable they were being spectators to suffering, showed how normalized it had become to record rather than rescue. Marlene stood over Faith and Hope with arms crossed, stood with body language that communicated she felt justified, stood with expression that showed no remorse, stood looking down at blind girl on floor and 14-year-old sister trying to help her, and she said with voice that carried through cabin, "Disabled passengers need to board separately, you're disrupting the cabin, perhaps you should have stayed home." And her words were cruel in their timing, were attack that came while Faith was still on floor searching for cane, were blame directed at victim for assault perpetrator had committed, and the suggestion that Faith should have stayed home, the characterization of blind child as disruption, the implication that disabled passengers didn't belong in main cabin, showed ableism that was profound, showed hatred that saw Faith's blindness as disqualifying her from public space. Hope looked up at Marlene with expression that mixed horror and fury, looked up from floor where she was cradling traumatized sister, looked up at adult who'd assaulted child and was now blaming her for it, and she said with voice that shook, "You kicked her cane, she's blind, she could have been seriously hurt, you did this on purpose," and her accusation was direct, was naming exactly what had happened, was refusing to let Marlene rewrite assault as accident, and the shock in Hope's voice, the recognition that adult with authority had deliberately harmed vulnerable child, the understanding that this was violence not negligence, communicated that 14-year-old was processing something her worldview hadn't prepared her for, was learning that people existed who would hurt disabled children deliberately. "Don't raise your voice at me, little girl," Marlene said with tone that was threatening, with words that asserted authority over child who was advocating for assaulted sister. And then she leaned closer with movement that brought her face near Hope's, leaned with proximity that felt intimidating, leaned so she could drop voice to venomous hiss that other passengers wouldn't hear clearly, and she said, "Your kind always wants special treatment. Blind and black and whatever excuse you use, you don't belong in the main cabin with regular passengers. You should be grateful you're allowed on the plane at all." And her words combined ableism and racism explicitly, combined contempt for Faith's disability with hatred for their race, combined suggestion that blindness was excuse rather than reality with characterization of black children as inherently out of place, and hearing that hatred directed at both her and her sister, hearing adults say they didn't belong, hearing flight attendants suggest their presence on aircraft was somehow illegitimate, made Hope understand they were facing discrimination that was intersectional, that targeted them for multiple aspects of identity simultaneously. Faith, hearing Marlene's words even through her distress, hearing that she didn't belong, hearing that she should have stayed home, started sobbing with sound that was broken, started crying with grief that went beyond physical pain of falling, started weeping with heartbreak of being told she was unwelcome, and she said through tears, "I just want to visit Grandma. Please, I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you being mean to me? I just want to see my grandma's grave." And her plea was innocence. Confronting cruelty, was child trying to find reason for adult hatred, was Faith attempting to make sense of why visiting grandmother's resting place had resulted in assault, and hearing her baby sister sob and plead and try to understand why she was being targeted, hearing Faith blame herself, hearing blind 12-year-old apologize for existing, shattered Hope's heart, shattered it completely, shattered it in ways that made protective rage mix with grief, shattered it while Marlene stood, unmoved by tears she'd caused, stood watching blind child cry with expression that showed satisfaction rather than remorse, stood demonstrating that cruelty was intentional, not accidental. "Your grandma should have taught you to stay where you belong," Marlene said with voice that dripped with contempt, with words that invoked their dead grandmother as weapon, with statement that suggested Ruth Williams had failed in her duties by not teaching granddaughters to accept second-class status. And hearing their beloved grandmother mentioned with such disrespect, hearing woman who'd marched for civil rights characterized as having failed, hearing Ruth's legacy twisted into justification for discrimination, made both sisters feel violation that went beyond personal assault, made them feel like their family's history was being attacked, made them understand that Marlene's hatred extended not just to them but to everyone who'd fought for dignity and equality, and the cruelty of using grandmother's memory against them. The deliberate choice to invoke deceased civil rights activist while discriminating against her granddaughters showed depth of Marlene's malice, showed she understood exactly what she was doing. Hope retrieved Faith's white cane from where it had clattered several rows down the aisle, retrieved it with hands that were shaking with fury, retrieved it while passengers watched without offering to help, retrieved it while carrying weight of knowing that every second Faith was without her mobility device was second of increased vulnerability and fear, and she returned to her sister and pressed the cane into Faith's trembling hands, pressed it with gentleness that contrasted with violence that had taken it away, and she helped Faith stand with movements that were careful, helped her into their assigned seat, helped her settle while trying to provide comfort through touch since words felt inadequate, and Faith clutched her recovered cane with grip that was tight, clutched it like she was afraid it might be taken again, clutched it while tears continued streaming down her face, while her breathing remained ragged from crying, while she tried to process trauma of being assaulted, and blamed and told she didn't belong. Around them, passengers continued watching with reactions that varied but that mostly resulted in inaction, continued observing two black girls dealing with aftermath of assault, continued holding up phones to record, and white man in business suit sitting in row 5 watched with expression that held smirk, watched with face that showed he found situation amusing or satisfying, watched with body language that communicated he agreed with Marlene's assessment that these girls didn't belong, and his smirk seeing blind child's distress, his visible satisfaction at witnessing discrimination, his apparent enjoyment of their suffering, showed that Marlene's hatred wasn't isolated, showed that passengers existed who supported her cruelty, showed that Faith and Hope faced not just one antagonist but cabin that contained multiple people who viewed their pain as entertainment or justice. And seeing that smirk, Seeing adult man derive pleasure from child's tears made Hope understand they were truly alone except for each other. A woman sitting with her husband in row 6 whispered those poor girls with tone that suggested sympathy, whispered with face that showed she recognized wrong was occurring, whispered with expression that communicated discomfort at what she was witnessing, but she didn't move, didn't challenge Marlene, didn't offer to help, didn't use her voice to defend children who were being targeted. And her husband, hearing her whisper, nodded agreement but also remained seated, also stayed silent, also chose witness without intervention, and their shared recognition that girls were suffering combined with their shared choice to do nothing about it, their sympathy that didn't translate into action, their discomfort that didn't motivate defense, showed how easily people convinced themselves that feeling bad was equivalent to being good, showed how witness without intervention enabled perpetrators, showed how passive disapproval facilitated active hatred. For the next 20 minutes after Faith was finally seated, for 20 minutes that felt eternal, for 20 minutes that would mark both girls permanently, Marlene made their flight unbearable through series of deliberate cruelties that were designed to humiliate, through sustained campaign of harassment that showed her initial assault wasn't isolated incident but beginning of pattern, through actions that demonstrated she intended to punish these girls for existing in space she believed they didn't deserve, and she walked past their row repeatedly during those 20 minutes. Walked past more often than service required, walked past with movements that brought her close to Faith's seat, and each time she passed she accidentally bumped Faith's shoulder with her hip, bumped with contact that was hard enough to jostle, bumped with force that made Faith flinch, bumped in way that appeared coincidental but that Hope recognized as deliberate, and watching her blind sister get bumped. Repeatedly, watching Faith unable to see attacks coming, watching her flinch and shrink with each contact, made Hope's protective rage intensify even as she felt powerless to stop it. Marlene announced loudly to cabin while gesturing toward Faith and Hope that special needs passengers were delaying service, announced with volume that ensured everyone heard, announced with emphasis on special needs that made it sound like accusation, announced while other passengers had caused no delays, announced creating narrative that Faith's blindness was disrupting everyone's experience, and her public characterization of them as problem, her loud attribution of delays that didn't exist. To disabled child who'd done nothing wrong, her choice to mark them as burdensome to other passengers, created hostile environment, created sense that Faith and Hope were unwelcome not just to Marlene but to entire cabin, created isolation that was profound, and Faith, hearing herself described as delay, hearing her disability publicly characterized as disruption, shrank further into her seat, made herself smaller, tried to become invisible, tried to take up less space. When Hope politely requested water for herself and Faith, when she pressed call button and asked with respect in her voice, when she made simple reasonable request for basic service, Marlene refused with claim that they hadn't asked properly, refused saying she didn't understand what they wanted, refused suggesting they needed to speak more clearly, refused creating barriers that didn't exist for other passengers, refused demonstrating that denial of service extended beyond mobility devices to basic necessities, and watching her sister be denied water, watching Marlene create excuses to withhold care, watching discrimination operate through small refusals that added up to sustained cruelty, made Hope understand that they were facing not just one violent moment but extended campaign of dehumanization, made her recognize that Marlene intended to make entire flight miserable, made her feel helpless because what could 14-year-old do against adult with authority at 30,000 feet? If you're watching this and you've ever recorded someone suffering without helping because documenting felt more important than defending, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who intervenes, because those passengers who watched Faith be assaulted and traumatized will carry guilt forever, will know they chose their phones over protecting child. So hit that subscribe button if you believe disabled children deserve defenders, not just documenters. Faith sat frozen in her window seat during those 20 minutes, sat with tears streaming silently down her cheeks, sat with body language that showed defeat, sat processing sustained discrimination through 12-year-old's understanding, sat trying to make sense of why adult hated her, sat internalizing messages that were being sent through words and actions, and she whispered to Hope with voice that was small and broken, "Maybe she's right, Hope. Maybe we shouldn't have come, maybe blind. People aren't supposed to fly, maybe I'm too much trouble, Maybe Grandma would understand if we just went home. And hearing those words, hearing her brilliant, brave, kind sister suggest that she was problem, hearing Faith internalize Marlene's hatred as truth about herself, hearing blind child conclude that her disability disqualified her from visiting grandmother's grave, broke Hope's heart in ways that felt irreparable, broke it with recognition that discrimination's worst damage wasn't physical bruises but psychological wounds, broke it with understanding that Marlene had succeeded in making Faith doubt her own worth, broke it with grief that baby sister who'd been so excited that morning now wanted to abandon sacred pilgrimage because flight attendant had convinced her she didn't belong. Hope's heart shattered completely hearing Faith blame herself, shattered watching sister who was brilliant at music and literature doubt her right to exist in public spaces, shattered seeing child who navigated world with such confidence reduced to apologizing for being blind, and she wrapped her arm around Faith pulling her close, pulled her with fierce protectiveness, pulled her while whispering you didn't do anything wrong, she's wrong not you, you belong here, you belong everywhere, Grandma. Would be so proud of you, we're going to visit her grave like we planned, but even as she spoke reassurances Hope felt inadequacy of words against sustained cruelty, felt like her comfort couldn't undo damage Marlene had inflicted, felt helpless watching Faith's spirit diminish despite her best efforts, and that helplessness, that recognition that she couldn't protect her sister from this hatred, that 14-year-old couldn't shield blind child from discrimination, made Hope feel like she was failing in fundamental duty. Around them passengers continued their various forms of witness without intervention, continued watching drama unfold while making individual calculations about whether to get involved, continued holding phones that recorded everything while bodies remained seated and voices stayed silent, and their continued inaction as Faith's distress became increasingly visible, their sustained choice to document rather than defend even as child's tears multiplied, their collective decision that recording was sufficient moral response, showed how thoroughly bystander culture had been normalized, showed how easily people convinced themselves that capturing evidence absolved them of responsibility to intervene, showed how discrimination operated partly through active perpetrators like Marlene but equally through passive witnesses who created an environment where hatred faced no immediate challenge, and watching passenger after passenger film her sister's suffering without offering help made Hope understand that danger came not just from flight attendant who'd assaulted Faith but from cabin full of adults who'd decided that child's trauma wasn't urgent enough to warrant their courage. The white man in business suit whose smirk had been so visible earlier continued watching with expression that held satisfaction, continued observing Faith's tears with face that showed he enjoyed spectacle, continued demonstrating through body language that he viewed this as entertainment or justified consequence. And occasionally he'd lean over to whisper something to passenger beside him, would whisper while gesturing toward Faith and Hope, would whisper while shaking his head, would whisper in ways that suggested he was providing commentary that supported Marlene's actions, and his visible enjoyment of their suffering, his apparent belief that blind black child deserved this treatment, his comfort expressing that belief publicly through smirks and whispers and gestures, showed that cabin contained people who weren't just passive witnesses but active supporters of discrimination, weren't just failing to intervene but actively endorsing cruelty, and knowing that adults existed who derived pleasure from Faith's pain made Hope feel sick, made her want to shield her sister from seeing, except Faith couldn't see, could only feel hostility in atmosphere, could only sense hatred that surrounded them. The woman who'd whispered those poor girls continued sitting with her husband, continued looking troubled but inactive, continued demonstrating that sympathy without action was performance, was feeling that made witness feel better about themselves without actually helping victim, and she would occasionally glance at Faith with expression that showed concern, would look at blind girl crying and appear moved, would seem on verge of standing or speaking, but then would look at her husband or look at Marlene or look at other passengers staying seated, and whatever she saw in those glances seemed to reinforce her decision to remain uninvolved, seemed to provide justification for continued silence, seemed to give permission to witness without defending, and watching her display sympathy that never translated into courage, watching her concern that remained entirely internal, watching her recognize suffering without taking any action to stop it, showed how bystander silence operated not through callousness but through calculated decision that personal comfort mattered more than child's safety, that avoiding confrontation was more important than preventing trauma. Other passengers had returned to their books and devices, and conversations after initial drama of assault had passed, had decided that since immediate crisis seemed resolved they could resume normal activities, had convinced themselves that since Faith was now seated the situation didn't require their attention and their ability to return to routine while child sat crying beside them, their capacity to read magazines while discrimination continued, their comfort resuming movies while harassment was ongoing, showed how easily people compartmentalized others' suffering, showed how thoroughly they could witness injustice without letting it interrupt their own experience, showed how normalized it had become to exist alongside cruelty without feeling obligation to challenge it, and Hope, watching passengers laugh at comedies and discuss dinner plans while her sister trembled with trauma, felt rage at their indifference, felt fury at their ability to ignore suffering that was happening in plain sight, felt contempt for their choice to prioritize entertainment over intervention. Faith's silent crying during those 20 minutes was perhaps most heartbreaking aspect, was shift from child who'd cried out when assaulted to child who wept without sound, was withdrawal that suggested she'd learned that expressing pain brought no help, was internalization of message that her distress didn't matter, and tears fell continuously down her cheeks while she sat perfectly still, while she clutched her white cane with both hands, while she seemed to shrink into herself and hope. Watching her sister cry silently, watching her try to make herself invisible, watching her accept suffering as something she had to endure alone, felt like witnessing spirit being crushed in real time, felt like watching discrimination achieve its goal of making Faith believe she was less deserving, felt like seeing grandmother's legacy of teaching them to stand proud being eroded by sustained hatred, and the transformation from joyful girl who'd been singing in car that morning to traumatized child who sat frozen and weeping, felt like watching light go out, felt like witnessing joy being systematically destroyed, felt like seeing innocence murdered by cruelty. The cumulative impact of Marlene's sustained harassment over 20 minutes was profound and devastating, was psychological damage that compounded with each bump and each public announcement and each denied request, was trauma that built through repetition until Faith's sense of safety and worth had been thoroughly undermined, and Hope, watching her sister deteriorate, watching confidence erode, watching pride transform into shame, understood that they were experiencing not just individual acts of discrimination but coordinated campaign designed to break them, designed to teach them that their bodies didn't belong in spaces reserved for people Marlene deemed normal, designed to reinforce hierarchy where disabled black children occupied bottom rung, and recognizing that intentionality, understanding that Marlene was deliberately traumatizing Faith, made Hope's rage intensify even as her helplessness grew, made her want to fight back even as she understood that 14-year-old had no power against uniformed adult at 30,000 feet. Faith's whispered question, "Maybe we shouldn't have come," continued echoing in Hope's mind, continued haunting her because it represented exactly what discrimination aimed to achieve, represented internalized oppression, represented victim accepting perpetrator's narrative, represented child concluding that problem was her existence rather than adults' hatred. And Hope knew their grandmother Ruth would be heartbroken hearing Faith say those words, would be devastated that granddaughter she'd taught to be proud was now apologizing for being blind, would grieve that legacy of dignity she tried to pass down was being eroded by flight attendants' cruelty, and thinking about grandmother, about Ruth Williams who'd faced fire hoses and police dogs and worse, about women who'd sung freedom songs while being arrested, about civil rights activists who'd taught them never to accept less than full humanity, made something start to shift in Hope's grief, made seed of resistance begin to form, made her start remembering lessons that might provide path forward. Other passengers' various reactions during these 20 minutes showed spectrum of moral failure, showed different ways that witnesses chose complicity, and some, like business suit man, actively supported discrimination through smirks and whispers, some, like sympathetic woman, passively enabled it through silence despite discomfort, some, like passengers who'd returned to entertainment, simply ignored it through deliberate inattention, but all contributed to environment where Marlene felt safe. Continuing harassment, all created cabin where blind child could be tormented without intervention, all demonstrated that hatred operated not just through individual bigots but through collective decision of witnesses to prioritize their own comfort over victim safety, and Hope, looking around cabin, seeing all these different forms of failure, seeing all these adults who'd chosen not to help, felt abandoned by everyone except Faith, felt like they existed in bubble of suffering that was visible to all but addressed by none. The physical toll of sustained stress was becoming visible on Faith as 20 minutes stretched toward 30, was showing in way her hands trembled constantly, in way her breathing remained uneven, in way her body held tension that suggested ongoing fear, and Hope could feel her sister shaking, could sense her distress through proximity, could understand that trauma was being embedded in real time, and she held Faith's hand trying to provide anchor, trying to communicate that she wasn't alone, trying to offer whatever comfort touch could provide when words felt inadequate, and Faith squeezed back with grip that was desperate, squeezed like Hope was only solid thing in world that had become hostile and unpredictable, squeezed with need that broke Hope's heart because it showed how thoroughly Marlene had succeeded in making Faith feel unsafe. Marlene's continued presence in cabin felt like ongoing threat, felt like perpetrator remaining visible to victim, felt like sustained intimidation, and each time she walked past their row, each time she bumped Faith's shoulder, each time she made announcement about special needs passengers, the trauma was reinforced, the message was repeated, the cruelty was extended, and Faith would tense when she heard Marlene's voice, would shrink when she sensed her approaching, would brace for impact she couldn't see coming, and her fear response to flight attendant who should have been ensuring her safety, her instinct to make herself smaller when authority figure approached, her learned expectation that adult meant danger, showed how discrimination trained victims to expect harm, showed how sustained harassment created hypervigilance, showed how 20 minutes of targeted cruelty could fundamentally alter child's sense of security in world. Hope felt rage building alongside her grief, felt fury at Marlene mixing with heartbreak for Faith, felt protective instinct warring with powerlessness, and she wanted to scream at passengers to help them, wanted to demand that someone intervene, wanted to shake witnesses until they understood that their silence was violence. But she was 14 and surrounded by adults who'd already demonstrated they wouldn't act. Was child trying to protect younger child in situation where every authority figure had failed? Was sister watching Faith break while feeling unable to stop it? And that combination of fury and helplessness created pressure that felt unbearable, created need to do something that conflicted with recognition that nothing she'd tried had worked, created desperation that was building toward breaking point. And in that moment of feeling most powerless, in that space between rage and grief, in that darkness where Faith sat broken beside her, Hope's mind went to their grandmother, went to Ruth Williams, went to woman who'd faced worse and survived, went to lessons about resistance and dignity and courage. Then Hope remembered something specific, remembered story their grandmother had told about being surrounded by hostile crowd during lunch counter sit-in. Remembered Ruth describing how fear had nearly paralyzed her, remembered detail about how she'd started singing to give herself courage, remembered grandmother saying that when hatred surrounded you the best weapon was collective voice, remembered Ruth teaching them the songs of the movement, remembered afternoons spent learning words and melodies and history, remembered grandmother's hands on piano showing them how music had been resistance, remembered Faith's joy learning those songs, remembered how their blind sister could memorize entire hymns after hearing them once, remembered Ruth saying these songs are your inheritance, remembered grandmother insisting they learn not just words but purpose, remembered being taught that silence in face of injustice was itself injustice, and remembering transformed Hope's helplessness into possibility, transformed her grief into determination, transformed her rage into strategy born from civil rights legacy. Hope remembered specifically the song their grandmother had sung most often, remembered Ruth's voice carrying the anthem of the movement, remembered lyrics about overcoming and believing and walking hand in hand, remembered how grandmother had explained that this song had given courage to people facing dogs and fire hoses and worse, remembered Ruth saying that when you sing together you stop being individuals and become movement, remembered being taught that their voices carried forward. Struggle of generations, remembered Faith learning every word and asking to sing it again and again, remembered how music had been Faith's connection to grandmother she couldn't see, remembered Ruth telling them that someday you might need this song, might need to remember that your people have survived worse, might need courage that comes from knowing you're part of something bigger, and in this moment surrounded by silent witnesses while Faith wept, Hope understood that someday had arrived. That this was moment grandmother had prepared them for, that civil rights legacy wasn't just history but living tool for current resistance. Hope stood slowly from her seat with movement that was deliberate, stood with decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable, stood while her heart pounded and her hands shook, stood knowing that what she was about to do would mark them even more visibly, stood understanding that singing would make them spectacle, stood recognizing that she might face consequences, stood anyway because sitting silent while Faith internalized hatred felt like betraying everything their grandmother had taught them, stood because Ruth Williams hadn't stayed quiet and neither would her granddaughter, stood because love for Faith outweighed fear of exposure, and the cabin fell quiet as passengers noticed 14-year-old black girl rising, fell quiet with curiosity about what would happen next, fell quiet in way that created space, fell quiet with attention that Hope was about to claim for purpose grandmother had modeled. She took deep breath that tried to steady her shaking, took breath that was preparation and prayer, took breath that connected her to grandmother and movement and generations of resistance, and she began to sing with voice that trembled at first but that grew stronger with each word, began with anthem that Ruth had taught her, began with song that had sustained people through worse, began singing about overcoming, about believing, about future where justice prevailed, and her voice was clear. Despite emotion, was strong despite fear, was unwavering in purpose even as it shook with feeling, and the familiar words that grandmother had sung while being arrested, that Ruth had taught during piano lessons, that Faith had learned by heart, filled the cabin with sound that was both defiant and beautiful, both resistance and prayer, both claim of dignity and refusal of shame. Faith recognized the song instantly despite her tears, recognized their grandmother's anthem, recognized melody and words that Ruth had made them practice, recognized sound of Hope's voice singing resistance, and despite everything that had happened, despite trauma and tears and broken spirit, despite wanting to disappear, despite Marlene's hatred, Faith joined her sister, joined with voice that was small at first but that found strength in unity, joined crying and singing simultaneously, joined because this was what grandmother had taught them to do, joined because Hope standing meant Faith couldn't stay silent, joined because singing together was how their people had always fought back, and two young black girls alone on plane full of witnesses began singing the movement's anthem, began reclaiming dignity through collective voice, began transforming individual suffering into political statement, began doing what Ruth Williams had done 60 years earlier when hatred had surrounded her. The sound of two children singing about overcoming while one was blind and both were crying created moment that was simultaneously heartbreaking and powerful, created scene that witnesses couldn't ignore, created intervention that didn't ask for permission or wait for adults, created resistance that was both vulnerable and fierce, and passengers who'd been silent, who'd been recording, who'd been returning to their entertainment, froze hearing those voices, froze recognizing the anthem, froze understanding that these girls were connecting present discrimination to civil rights history, froze as their various justifications for inaction became suddenly inadequate, froze as two children did what cabin full of adults hadn't, froze as Hope and Faith transformed aircraft into site of moral reckoning, and the businessman's smirk vanished, and the sympathetic woman began to cry, and phones that had been recording lowered as witnesses started to truly see, started to recognize that documenting wasn't enough, started to understand that these girls were calling them to account, started to feel weight of their own silence. Passengers throughout cabin experienced shift that was profound, experienced moment when witnessing became unbearable, experienced recognition that staying silent made them complicit, and the sound of Hope's voice singing words about justice and Faith's voice joining despite tears, the sight of two young black girls standing together using their grandmother's anthem as shield and weapon simultaneously, the connection to movement that had demanded America live up to its promises, created moral pressure that passive observation couldn't withstand, created call to action that was impossible to ignore, created invitation to choose between continued complicity and active solidarity, and something shifted in cabin atmosphere, something changed in collective consciousness, something transformed witnesses into potential participants, and elderly white woman sitting in row 3 felt that shift most acutely, felt it as personal reckoning, felt it as memory and responsibility colliding. Margaret Henderson was 78 years old and had marched in Selma in 1965, had walked alongside black neighbors who'd become family, had sung these same songs while facing state troopers, had been part of movement that she'd believed had changed world, and hearing Hope and Faith sing the anthem she'd sung 60 years earlier transported her across decades, transported her to moments when her own courage had been tested, transported her to understanding that fight she'd thought was finished was still being fought by children, and she remembered that song giving her strength when she'd been terrified, remembered collective voice creating courage that individual fear couldn't sustain, remembered how singing together had transformed isolated protesters into movement, and hearing these girls invoke that legacy while suffering discrimination she'd thought her generation had ended, hearing them call on history she'd helped make while cabin full of people stayed silent, made her understand that her witness without action betrayed everything she'd marched for, made her recognize that staying seated now negated standing up then. Margaret rose slowly from her seat with movement that was deliberate despite her age, rose with joints that were stiff but with resolve that was absolute, rose while other passengers watched her, rose knowing that her standing might give others permission, rose because two black girls had reminded her who she was supposed to be, and she began to sing with them, began adding her voice to theirs, began with words she'd sung while being tear-gassed, began with anthem that had sustained her through fear, began with melody that connected past struggle to present resistance, and her voice was older now but it carried weight of experience, carried authority of having marched, carried validation that these girls were part of lineage, and watching elderly white women stand and join them, watching her add voice that had sung these words in original movement, watching her choose solidarity over comfort, created ripple effect that spread through cabin. A black veteran sitting across aisle in row 9 stood next after Margaret, stood with recognition that these girls deserved protection his generation had fought to secure, stood with shame at having stayed silent, stood with determination to do better, stood and added his voice with power that came from military service and civil rights consciousness, and then young white mother traveling with infant in row 7 stood while holding her baby, stood with tears streaming down her face, stood with recognition that she wanted her child to grow up in a world where people intervened, stood and sang while her voice shook, and then Latino grandfather traveling with grandchildren in row 11 stood pulling his family up with him, stood teaching his grandchildren in real time about resistance, stood adding Spanish accented voice to growing chorus, and one by one passengers throughout cabin rose, one by one they joined the song, one by one they transformed from witnesses into participants, one by one. They chose solidarity. The song swelled, filling the aircraft cabin with sound that was collective and powerful, swelled with voices that ranged from strong to trembling but that all chose to be heard, swelled with passengers who minutes earlier had been silent now adding their voices to anthem, swelled with people who'd recorded now putting down phones to sing, swelled with witnesses who'd stayed seated now standing in rows, swelled until cabin that had been site of isolation became space of community, swelled until Faith and Hope who'd been alone were surrounded by chorus, swelled until discrimination that had operated through silence was challenged by collective voice, and the transformation from individual suffering to collective resistance, from isolated victims to movement however temporary, from cabin of bystanders to aircraft full of people claiming moral position, showed power of what their grandmother had taught them, showed that songs of resistance still worked, showed that invoking civil rights legacy could still move people to action. Marlene backed away watching this unfold, backed away with face that went pale, backed away with recognition that she'd lost control completely, backed away with understanding that passengers she'd expected to support or ignore her discrimination had instead turned against her, backed away with realization that assaulting blind child had triggered response she couldn't contain, backed away while cabin full of people sang anthem that indicted her cruelty, backed away while her authority evaporated, backed away while the power dynamics that had allowed her harassment reversed, backed away toward rear galley with expression showing panic, and watching flight attendant who'd seemed invincible moments earlier retreat in fear, watching adult who'd assaulted Faith face consequences of collective resistance, watching Marlene's hatred meet response she hadn't anticipated, gave Hope fierce satisfaction even as tears continued falling, gave Faith sense that maybe they weren't as powerless as Marlene had made them feel. The captain emerged from cockpit alarmed by commotion, emerged hearing song that filled aircraft, emerged to scene he'd never witnessed in decades of flying, emerged to passengers standing and singing while two young black girls stood at center, emerged with confusion that quickly transformed into concern, emerged asking what's happening here with voice that carried authority but also genuine bewilderment, emerged into moment that would require him to choose sides, emerged into situation where remaining neutral meant choosing discrimination, emerged into cabin where moral lines had been drawn and where his response would matter profoundly to Faith and Hope, who watched him with mixture of hope and fear, and he saw passengers standing with tears streaming, saw elderly white woman and black veteran and young mother and Latino grandfather all singing together, saw two children at center who appeared traumatized, saw scene that demanded explanation, and Margaret Henderson stepped forward. To provide it, stepped forward with voice that was firm despite her age, stepped forward as witness who would no longer stay silent. That flight attendant assaulted a blind child, Margaret said with voice that carried through cabin even over fading song. With words that were precise and damning, she kicked her white cane out from under her deliberately, watched her fall to the floor, stood over her and told her she didn't belong here, called them racial slurs, said disabled passengers should have stayed home, told them their grandmother should have taught them to stay where they belong. We all saw it, some of us recorded it. Some of us did nothing, and her voice cracked with emotion saying that last part, cracked with recognition of her own initial failure. But these girls, she continued with tears falling, these brave beautiful girls reminded us who we're supposed to be. They sang the song I sang in Selma 60 years ago. They called us to account with their grandmother's anthem. They did what we should have done from the beginning. And her testimony was both accusation of Marlene and confession of her own. Complicity was witness finally speaking truth, was elder validating children's experience. The captain's expression hardened hearing Margaret's account, hardened with recognition of severity, hardened with understanding that serious assault had occurred on his aircraft, and he turned to Marlene asking, "Is this true?" with voice that demanded honest answer, asking with tone that communicated he would verify whatever she said, asking while passengers who'd recorded prepared to show evidence. And Marlene stammered trying to construct defense, stammered saying they're exaggerating, the girl. Tripped, "I was just trying to maintain order, they were being disruptive," but her stammering contradicted her words, her visible panic undermined her denials, her backing away showed consciousness of guilt, and Captain's face showed he didn't believe her, showed he recognized lies when he heard them, showed he understood that crew member had committed assault. "I have video," young man in row 12 said holding up his phone, "have all of it, everything she said, everything she did, the kick, the fall, the harassment, everything," and his willingness to provide evidence, his documentation that had seemed like mere witness now becoming tool for accountability, his recording that could have been intervention finally serving purpose, transformed his earlier failure into current usefulness even as it couldn't undo his initial silence, and other passengers nodded, saying, "We have video too, we saw everything, we can verify what happened," and their chorus of witness that came too late to prevent trauma but that could support justice, their collective testimony that should have been intervention but was at least now documentation, created record that Marlene couldn't deny, created evidence that Captain couldn't ignore. The captain's expression moved from hard to absolutely furious hearing confirmation, moved to rage that crew member under his authority had assaulted child, moved to recognition that this incident would have severe consequences, and he said to Marlene with voice that was controlled but deadly, "You're confined to the rear galley for remainder of this flight. Do not interact with passengers. Do not leave that area. Security will meet you upon landing. Your employment is likely terminated." This is assault on a minor and disability discrimination, and his immediate removal of Marlene from passenger contact, his swift action to protect Faith and Hope from further harassment, his clear statement of consequences, represented authority finally being used to defend rather than threaten, represented power finally protecting vulnerable rather than enabling perpetrator, and watching Marlene being confined, watching her lose authority, watching her face consequences, gave Faith and Hope first sense of justice, first recognition that adults in power sometimes did right thing. The captain then knelt before Faith and Hope with movement that brought him to their eye level, knelt with humility that recognized they deserved respect, knelt so Faith could sense his presence without him looming over her, and he said, "I am so deeply sorry for what happened to you. What you experienced is completely unacceptable. You should never have been treated this way. This is failure of my crew and my airline. You deserved protection and care and you received violence instead, I give you my word that this will be addressed fully, that everyone responsible will face consequences, that your story will be heard, and his apology, while it couldn't undo assault, at least acknowledged harm, while it couldn't restore Faith's sense of safety, at least validated that wrong had occurred, while it couldn't erase 20 minutes of harassment, at least promised accountability. Faith reached out with trembling hand, reached out searching for Captain's voice, reached out wanting human connection after experiencing hatred, and she found his hand and held it with grip that was gentle, held it while saying thank you sir with voice that was hoarse from crying. Our grandma always said most people are good, they just need reminding sometimes. She taught us that even when people are mean we should remember that love is stronger than hate. She marched so we could fly on planes without being hurt, and I think she'd want me to tell you thank you for listening, and hearing blind 12-year-old who'd been assaulted extend grace to Captain. Hearing her invoke grandmother's wisdom about human goodness after experiencing human cruelty, hearing her maintain faith in people despite every reason not to, made Captain's eyes fill with tears, made him understand that he was in presence of extraordinary courage, made him recognize that these children possessed dignity that adults around them lacked. Your grandmother was a wise woman, the captain said with voice thick with emotion, and she raised a granddaughter who has her strength and her grace. You didn't deserve what happened, you deserve so much better, and I promise you we will do better. And his promise felt genuine, felt like commitment, not just words, felt like recognition that this incident demanded systemic change, not just individual punishment. And hope, watching Captain kneel before her sister, watching him take accountability, watching him promise justice, felt some of rage that had been sustaining her transform into exhausted relief, felt recognition that singing had worked, that grandmother's strategy had succeeded, that resistance had moved witnesses to action and authority to intervention, and she wrapped her arm around Faith, pulling her close while both sisters cried with release of tension they'd been holding, cried with grief for trauma they'd endured, cried with gratitude that ordeal was ending, cried while passengers who'd joined their song watched with tears streaming down their own faces, cried while understanding that justice was coming even if healing would take longer. When the plane landed at Nashville International Airport, when wheels touched down at destination that held their grandmother's grave, when aircraft finally reached ground after flight that had become trauma, airline security and corporate officials boarded immediately before any passengers were allowed to deplane, boarded with instructions from headquarters, boarded with awareness that serious incident had occurred, boarded with authority to take immediate action, and they moved directly to rear galley where Marlene had been confined, moved with purpose that communicated consequences were imminent, moved while passengers watched knowing that justice was being served visibly, and Marlene was escorted off aircraft in handcuffs before she reached terminal, was removed while every passenger who'd witnessed her cruelty watched, was terminated effective immediately with badge collected and career ended, was walked past Faith and Hope who sat holding hands, was removed from aviation industry permanently, and her employee record when reviewed revealed 3 prior complaints of racial incidents that had been filed and buried, revealed pattern of discrimination that Airline had failed to address, revealed that Faith and Hope weren't first victims, just first whose story couldn't be suppressed. But consequences didn't stop with Marlene's termination, didn't end with removing one perpetrator, didn't conclude with punishing active discrimination, because Airline reviewed every recording from flight, reviewed videos that passengers had taken, reviewed documentation that showed not just Marlene's assault but witnesses in action, and they identified 14 passengers who had watched and recorded and done nothing. 14 people who had witnessed disabled child being assaulted and had chosen documentation over intervention, 14 witnesses who had prioritized their phones over Faith's safety, and each received letter informing them they were banned from Airline for 6 months to 2 years for failing to intervene while child was harmed, for choosing complicity over courage, for demonstrating that they viewed suffering as spectacle rather than emergency requiring response. And the message was clear and unprecedented, was statement that witnessing cruelty and choosing silence made you complicit, was recognition that bystanders enabled perpetrators, was policy that said moral neutrality in face of assault was itself violation. The story made national news within hours, made headlines across country, made front pages and evening broadcasts, and video of Hope singing and Faith joining through tears and passengers rising one by one went viral, was shared millions of times, was watched by people who wept seeing two children transform aircraft into site of resistance, was viewed by millions who recognized Anthem and understood connection to civil rights movement, was seen by audiences who felt shame at their own past. Silences, and Margaret Henderson, the elderly white woman who'd stood first, was interviewed on multiple networks, was asked to explain why she joined the girls, and she said with voice that carried weight of years, "I marched in 1965. I thought those days were behind us. I believed we'd solve this. But hatred never dies completely, it just waits, it just finds new victims. Those girls reminded me that fight isn't over, reminded me that staying silent makes you part of problem, reminded me that witnessing without intervening is betrayal of everything I marched for, and I won't sit silent again. I won't watch children suffer without helping. I won't let age or comfort or fear keep me from standing up." 3 days after the flight, 3 days that Faith and Hope spent recovering with their parents, 3 days that included therapy sessions and medical examinations and processing trauma, the sisters stood at their grandmother's grave in Nashville Cemetery, stood at headstone that marked Ruth Williams' resting place, stood in space that had been destination all along, and Hope placed fresh flowers on the grave with hands that were gentle, placed roses that were Ruth's favorite, placed blooms that represented love and remembrance, and Faith knelt at the headstone with permission to run her fingers over engraved name, ran them over letters that spelled out grandmother she'd loved, ran them over dates that marked life dedicated to justice, and she said with voice that was soft, "Grandma, we sang your song, on a plane full of people who forgot what it meant. We sang and they remembered, we sang and they stood up. We sang because you taught us how, because you showed us that our voices matter, because you gave us courage we needed, and I think you heard us, Grandma. I think you were there." And Hope wrapped her arm around Faith saying she heard you, baby sister. She's so proud of us. She's proud that we used what she taught us, that we stood up like she stood up. Their parents arrived at cemetery having flown separately after hearing what happened, having spent 3 days caring for traumatized daughters, having dealt with airline and media and lawyers, and their mother pulled both girls into her arms sobbing, pulled them with fierce protectiveness, pulled them while saying, "My brave, brave girls, you did what grown folks couldn't. You stood up when everyone else sat down. You used your grandmother's legacy to fight back, and I'm so sorry you had to, so sorry you experienced that hatred, so sorry adults failed you, but so proud of how you responded, so proud that you remembered who you are." And their father, who was quiet man who rarely showed emotion, knelt at grave beside his daughters, knelt with tears falling, knelt saying, "Mama, you raised me right, taught me dignity and courage and resistance, and I raised them the same, passed down everything you gave me, and they proved it, proved that your legacy lives on, proved that your teaching matters, proved that fight you fought isn't finished but that next generation is ready." If you're watching this and you've ever been the bystander who filmed suffering without helping because documenting felt safer than defending, subscribe to this channel right now and commit to being the person who intervenes, because those 14 passengers who were banned learned that witness without action has consequences. So hit that subscribe button if you believe protecting children matters more than recording their pain. 1 month after incident, Airline announced new policy called Faith and Hope Protocol, announced mandatory training for all crew members on disability accommodations and bystander intervention, announced zero tolerance for discrimination, announced that failure to assist passenger in distress or witnessing harassment without reporting was grounds for immediate termination, and training video featured Hope and Faith standing together with Faith's white cane in hand, featured them delivering message to thousands of airline employees, and Hope spoke first saying, "When someone is hurting, don't just watch. Don't just record, help them, intervene, use your voice, use your power, be the person who stands up." And Faith added with smile that was soft, "And if you're ever scared to stand up alone, remember you can always sing. Someone will join you. Our grandma taught us that collective voice is stronger than individual fear, taught us that resistance works." But resolution wasn't perfect because Faith had PTSD from assault, had nightmares about falling, had anxiety about flying that required therapy, had hypervigilance around authority figures, had trust that had been damaged, and Hope had guilt about not preventing attack, had rage that surfaced unexpectedly, had protective instincts that became overactive, had her own therapy addressing trauma of watching sister be hurt while feeling powerless, and faith and hope protocol while helping future. Passengers couldn't give back sense of safety that Marlene had stolen, couldn't restore innocence that discrimination had taken, couldn't undo damage that remained despite justice, and that imperfect resolution, that accountability without complete healing, that systemic change that existed alongside individual trauma, was what real life looked like when hatred targeted children but courage rose to meet it.